The Senate Parliamentarian strikes down Republicans' plan for partial NFA repeal. Plus, Rhode Island becomes the latest state to pass a so-called assault weapon ban. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. TheReload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It'll keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. The big news this week, obviously, is one that actually, the news that came down quite late last night. So very recently before we recorded this, we finally have a verdict on whether or not NFA reform is going to make it into Trump's one big beautiful bill. The Senate Parliamentarian officially ruled that the complete delisting, anyway, of suppressors, short-barrel rifle, short-barrel shotguns, and any other weapons cannot be included in that bill. So the Parliamentarian has stripped those provisions.
Yeah, big decision. Obviously, it's something that we've been focused on and covering for weeks now here at The Reload, and something that we said was honestly a very likely possibility, right? There were a lot of people claiming that there was no way this would happen, that the delisting has to go through, that there's no other interpretation, and that is not what we were hearing from sources. And, you know, it always seemed like, if not a long shot, a questionable possibility that it could get through reconciliation, and that it was much riskier than trying what the House Ways and Means Committee had initially put forward, which is just a elimination of the tax on silencers, and which then later got expanded to include short barrel firearms, as you mentioned, and any other weapons, which doesn't mean like literally any other weapons. It's a special category in the National Firearms Act that's hard to explain, especially in text without getting confusing. But basically, it's sort of concealed, like guns that are disguised to look like other things. So basically, like umbrella guns that you might see in like Kingsman or something, or cane guns, things that really were, I guess, a novelty at one point and have kind of completely faded out ever since they were regulated on the NFA. But that's included in there anyway. So I think our reporting indicated that this was not a sure thing by any means, and there were good reasons to think it might not get through the parliamentarian process, the Byrd rule, as it's called, because of how it was constructed. And that's what happened here, right? That's what very late at night, and I was lazy and didn't finish the newsletter until super late, so I was still awake when this happened. But it came out after midnight, and significant setback, obviously, for gun rights advocates who really, they were all on board with trying this approach, the full delisting, which would have not just gotten rid of the tax on these items, but also eliminated the registration requirements, the reporting requirements if you cross state lines, things of that nature that come along with owning an NFA item. But some of them were much more aggressive, obviously, in how they advocated to get that language in the bill. GOA and National Association for Gun Rights were really harsh on how they went after the House Ways and Means Republicans for their initial proposals, saying it wasn't enough, and then it was even the betrayal of gun rights advocates, whereas the House Ways and Means Republicans had argued that this would happen, that it wouldn't make it through, and that's why they went with the language they did. Now, to be fair to those gun rights groups, they still have made some movement here, and the process is not over yet, right? The initial House Ways and Means language only covered silencers, or suppressors. Silencers is the kind of the marketing term, the marketing name that Maxim came up with for them in the early days, and it is the statutory term from than the NFA, but obviously it's a bit misleading because silencers don't totally silence gunshots. And so a lot of people in the industry and the gun rights movement prefer to call them suppressors. You could also call them mufflers. It's literally the same technology as a car muffler, but it depends on where you are in the world. A lot of places will call them mufflers, but in America, they're primarily known as silencers. Anyway, moving on to where we're at right now. I interviewed Senator Cornyn, John Cornyn from Texas, the Republican, who's often one of the main players when it comes to gun legislation in the Senate. That's actually something that's gotten him in trouble in the primary he's going through right now, is because he was part of the coalition of bipartisan senators, Republican senators that joined the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act back in 2022, which angered a lot of gun rights activists and Republicans in Texas. And so he's being primaried by the Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton, who has his own baggage, more corruption-related stuff. He was they actually tried to impeach him down there and failed, his own party. So interesting primary playing out there, but he has championed this provision. He wanted to go. He was on board, as the rest of the Senate Finance Committee was, with trying delisting. But the plan was always that there would be a fallback to just the tax cut if the delisting didn't pass the Byrd rule. And so that's where we are now. And Cornyn has already confirmed that that's what Republicans are now doing. There's kind of a process where you can rerun these provisions. There's been a bunch of provisions that have gotten stripped out, which happens every time there's a reconciliation bill. Sometimes there's more, sometimes there's less. This time they're basically trying to do the whole Republican agenda through reconciliation this time around. So there's a lot more in there, and you're having a lot more of these fights over what complies with the Byrd rule and what doesn't. But we've already seen several provisions that got stripped out, like the one on SNAP, cutting SNAP benefits, has been rewritten and run back through and cleared. And so that's probably what you're going to see here. Cornyn has said they're already working on doing that. It could even happen as early as today, because one of the big risks that remains is, and this is something we talked about at the time when there was, this change was made, and especially when the Senate language came out. One of the risks is, that language didn't leave room for, potentially stripping part of the provision and leaving the other part in, as the House language kind of had. The House language set it up to the two separate sections of the same provision. The tax elimination and the delisting were kind of separated in the language, whereas the Senate bill didn't go that direction. They just went for straight delisting. But one of the problems is the sort of self-imposed timetable that Republicans have here. They want to get the bill, the whole bill, passed through the Senate and the House and to President Donald Trump's desk by Friday, next Friday. So they have a week to do that, which is not a lot of time. And so I guess the main concern would be if this gets pushed to the wayside, because they just don't have the time to rerun this while they're trying to rerun everything else. But I don't know. I think right now the most likely scenario is they get the tax cut through. They've already got language for it, right? I mean, it's not like they have to start from scratch to rewrite this thing. This was a fallback from, we talked to Knox Williams from the American Suppressor Association on the show a couple of weeks back, the interview podcast. And that was something that, he said, yes, there is if it doesn't make it through, the plan would be to try and push the tax cut instead. And so they seem prepared to do that already. And we might have a ruling on that as soon as today. But you never know in the Senate. A lot of this stuff too is it's a fairly opaque process behind closed doors to a large degree. We don't see them consulting the parliamentarian in public. It all happens between senators and Senate staff and the parliamentarian's office. So We don't know exactly where this process is at today, other than what Cornyn has said, that they are doing this. They are pushing, and that all of those things are going to be included, not just silencers, but short barrel shotguns and rifles and AOWs. So that's the plan now. Delisting failed, and now the plan is to hope they have time to get the tax cut through. Yeah. Instead,
you see, they're shifting to their excuse me, they're shifting to their plan B, that one that, as you mentioned, everyone seemed to be sort of aware of. That was a strong possibility that they would have to default to plan B, but that hasn't stopped at least some people online floating a little more of a drastic provision to try to make their plan A work, which you discussed a little bit in a members piece that you wrote for us this week. Can you just dive into a little bit of these more, let's say, drastic proposals that are floating around?
Yeah, so and you saw this. You saw some people preemptively saying this, which was essentially, technically, the parliamentarian's role here is just to advise the senators. That she doesn't make up the rules. She just interprets them, and technically, her interpretation can be overridden by a majority if they so chose. And technically, she serves at the pleasure of the Senate Majority Leader, so she can be removed. Technically, you see how I'm putting technically in here a lot, and there's a good reason for that, which is that in practice, that's extremely unlikely to happen, especially over this particular provision, which is not a high priority provision for Republicans. Like, I mean, it's not one that they have much disagreement on. It seems didn't seem like anyone in the caucus was really trying to stop this from getting into the bill. So that it's not necessarily something controversial within the Republican caucus. We did have Senator Lummis had some concerns about the state NFA mirror laws and the implications there for delisting, although they did actually try to address that, as we talked about on the previous episodes. But, all that's stripped out now, and that concern doesn't exist anymore, because cutting the tax won't have any impact on those state mirror laws, because you'll still have to get the registration even if they cut the tax to zero. Similar to what happened with the pistol brace ban, where they zeroed out the tax for registrations under that rule, even though that rule obviously was blocked in court later on. But regardless, so you've seen some gun rights activists now calling for, overruling the parliamentarian or firing them, and it's just not likely to happen. And I should explain maybe the process a little bit. It is opaque, right? As I described, like, we don't get a ruling from the parliamentarian. The only reason we know this has even happened is because the ranking member from the Senate Budget Committee, which isn't even where the language for the NFA provisions come from, that came from the Finance Committee, but he's been putting out updates, press releases on his own, saying which provisions have been stripped out of reconciliation and essentially subject to the 60 vote threshold under the filibuster. Because remember, the whole point of this process is to get budget bills through the Senate quicker than regular policy legislation. And to do that, the senators agree to this process where you only need 50 votes, but there are strict rules that govern, strict and fairly opaque, I would say, rules that govern what is a budget provision and what isn't. And the idea, to boil it, there's a bunch of rules. There's like the bird rule, but it's really like 5 parts, and it has to do with like where the legislation emanates from. It has to be from the right committee for the right that oversees that particular part of budget law. There's a bunch more rules, but the bottom line of it is that the provisions are supposed to be primarily budgetary in nature. They're supposed to have a primarily budgetary effect, because the obvious problem that you run into with reconciliation process is that anything you do will have some kind of budgetary effect, right? It'll have some impact on spending or taxing or what have you, right? And so what they're trying to do with this process to protect the rights of the minority senators, essentially, who are giving up this ability to filibuster, is strip out anything that's more for a policy purpose than it is for having a budgetary purpose. And so that's where delisting always had a bit of a problem. Like, yes, the NFA, as we heard from, like Knox on the show, there was a logic to this argument. The delisting argument it wasn't a crazy idea, right? The idea was essentially the NFA is a tax. First and foremost, that's what it is. The registration aspect of the NFA is there to show that you've paid the tax. There are other regulations involved, but they're all in service of collecting this tax, right? That's the argument. And so basically anything you do within that should be viewed as a primarily budget-oriented measure. Of course, the problem with that reasoning has been, and you can kind of see this in a lot of the reactions to the parliamentarian ruling, that this is outside of the reconciliation process that doesn't fit, which is that people are saying, I don't care about the tax, I care about the registration. I don't want to have to register my gun. I don't want to have to do the report to, law enforcement when I'm crossing state lines with my NFA items. I don't want to do these other aspects of the regulations that come along with this law. And the problem is, if that's the main purpose of the provision, then it's unlikely the parliamentarian is going to find that it's primarily a budget purpose. Like, you're trying to eliminate this registration requirement because people don't like having to register their items, not because you're trying to balance the budget or something. There may be a budgetary impact, but that was the hard part. Now, the caveat to all what I just explained there, that's my best guess of why this happened, of why it got stripped out. And that was the main argument for why it would likely get stripped out. We don't know that's why. We don't get, this goes back to the opaque process. We don't actually get any explanation from the Senate parliamentarians themselves. In fact, what we get, the only way we know is, again, the ranking member of the budget committee put out a press release where he said, oh yeah, this got stripped out. And he even used his own, description of the provision, and which included, pretty partisan description of what the bill was doing. And he said he just described short barrel rifles and shotguns as, quote, easily concealable guns, which is probably not what a gun rights activist would describe those items as, right? So, you kind of, it filters through senators before you hear from the parliamentarian, because the Senate is a very insular institution, right? And the parliamentarian it works for them and works with them and gives them advice one way or the other, and does it in private, essentially. The way the process works, as far as I understand it from the sources that I've spoken to in the Senate and even former parliamentarians, basically the parliamentarian will go around before a bill gets written, or they won't go around, but senators will go to them and ask for advice, and they'll give informal advice on whether or not they think something will get through, or what issues they might see with it. And then the text gets written. Then they go through the formal process where, the minority senators will object to certain provisions and say, hey, we don't think this complies with the Byrd rule. And then they'll have kind of like it's not a court hearing necessarily, but they have like a hearing where each side gives their arguments to the parliamentarian, and then the parliamentarian makes a decision about whether their advice, their belief, their ruling is that it complies with the Byrd rule or not. And as far as I understand, I think there's some back and forth there. So they explain to the senators and the staffers why they think this. And then that's why you see what's happening now with this NFA provision. Though sometimes, if the problems are potentially solvable, the issues are solvable, they'll just rewrite the provision and send it back through, and hope to get a more favorable ruling the second time around, which has happened again with several provisions already in this Republican bill. Now, the provisions can get stripped out, and maybe they were a little bit controversial anyway. And Republican, there's a whole political art to this process too, obviously. So stuff can get in there that maybe the senators knew wasn't going to go through, but they wanted to make people happy. Maybe that's what happened here. Obviously they had a lot of pressure to try this from the gun rights activists, and they did try it. But even if maybe they didn't, I don't have reporting on this. I don't want to say this is what happened, but it's possible that they did it. And as like a fine, we'll try it if you to make you guys happy, but they might think it's probably not going to work. But anyway, so that, that whole process, there's a ruling, then they can go back with what they gleaned from this conversation with the parliamentarian before the ruling came down and rewrite the bill to the text, the provision to try and get it through, a second time. And they can even, I think, once the text is fully through the Byrd process, they can even during the floor stage of the debate, they can offer up amendments. There's going to be a bunch of amendments offered up. It's going to be, there'll probably be a lot of Democratic amendments offered up. It says like show vote kind of things that don't get anywhere, but they're done for political. That happens a lot in Congress, right? Political votes that everyone knows won't get through, but they still want to get people on the record. You'll get a lot of that, but you might also get last ditch efforts by some Republicans to get some provisions back in. And then you have like a more instantaneous process of like the parliamentarian rules right away on whether those floor provisions are kosher with the Byrd rule or not. So if you're a gun rights advocate right now and you're hoping to get something out of this, I think you're hoping that Cornyn is telling the truth here, and they are currently trying to rerun the tax cut. But we'll have to see. I don't know where it's going, but I can say, to your initial question or point here, the parliamentarian is almost certainly not going anywhere. There's very little reason to think that Senate leadership will overrule her or fire her. She's been in the job since 2012. She's already served previous Republican majority. And she wasn't replaced when the new majority got put into place. And there's the reason that happens, as I think I alluded to earlier, is just essentially the whole reconciliation process is designed to protect the filibuster. And so if you mess with it for any political reasons, any reasons that the other side is going to view as political. So, and in this case, if you just fire her or overrule her on the provisions on her determinations that you don't like because you want to get certain parts into the bill, that's absolutely going to be viewed as nuking the parliamentarian, which is in practice akin to nuking the filibuster itself. Because, if you can just say, well, the parliamentarian's wrong and this is a budget provision, guess what Democrats are going to do next time they get into power? Now, there are some people, I think Costas Morris, gun rights lawyer in California, we had on the show a bunch of times, very active on Twitter. I was discussing this with him the other day. And, there's people who look at the situation and say, well, Democrats have already tried to push to end the filibuster, right? And certainly that's true. In fact, I would say that the Democrats have made more serious attempts to do that than Republicans at this point, although they've both eliminated parts of the filibuster in the past, the judicial filibuster. That started when Harry Reid nuked it for lower court judges. Then Republicans took the next step of getting rid of it for Supreme Court justices under the first Trump administration. And now there's no more judicial filibuster at all, essentially. So, both sides have gone this way. And there was one time where a parliamentarian has been fired. Trent Lott in 2001 fired the parliamentarian at that time. Although that parliamentarian is interesting. There's only been 6 of these people since 1935 when the position was created. And so you can kind of get just a view from that the firing parliamentarian is just not a thing that really ever happens. And Trent Lott's example is kind of an exception that proves the rule, because when he fired that parliamentarian over frustration with how they were ruling on reconciliation stuff, it caused a huge uproar and backlash and ended up where they replaced that parliamentarian with the previous parliamentarian who had served under the previous Democratic majority anyway. So they didn't end up replacing the guy with like a outright, some sort of partisan replacement that just started ruling in their favor on everything. They kind of had to almost immediately clean up that mess and put someone Democrats were okay with in the position to, preserve the way things were operating. So it can happen. It's just extremely unlikely to happen. And then I guess, honestly, the most straightforward thing is that Thune has already multiple times said he won't do that, including yesterday. So it's just like, if you're, I can understand why people want, especially people who were told that this was guaranteed to get through, or was the only reasonable interpretation of the rules, why they would be very frustrated and blame the parliamentarian. But this was something that was always had a good chance of happening, and isn't necessarily because the parliamentarian is biased against Republicans or whatever. Certainly, I don't think most of the Republican senators seem to feel that way. There are a few. Tommy Tuberville has called for her firing, so it's not total silence, but it's also like Tommy Tuberville is not, I think, a highly influential member of the Senate, even in the Republican caucus, honestly. So unless you start seeing people like Cornyn and mainly Thune, but like if McConnell started talking about firing the parliamentarian, then you would have good indication to think maybe that'll happen. Right now, Cornyn, for instance, basically said, we expect these sort of setbacks to happen, and we're going to move forward with the tax cut now instead. So he didn't express any eagerness to fire the parliamentarian over this, and I just don't think it's going to happen. Definitely not over this. I don't think it'll happen at all, honestly, but we'll have to see. We'll certainly continue covering it and keep on top of it, though.
Yeah, absolutely. Bottom line is it didn't get through the parliamentarian. They're going to push forward with the plan B of the tax cut. They have probably a strong possibility of getting that through, but they're also up against that crunch time deadline that you referred to. And like you said, very unlikely to see the parliamentarian brushed aside over this issue as well. But like you said, stay tuned to the Reload to get the latest updates on this. But outside of Capitol Hill, we had actually some interesting movement at the state level. Another instance of a state joining sort of this, I would say, second wave of state level assault weapon ban legislation. The state of Rhode Island has officially become the 11th state to restrict common semi-automatic firearms like AR-15s and the like by passing a bill. And actually, a couple days after I wrote this article, their governor quickly signed it into law. So it's already become law in Rhode Island. Yeah,
the sort of post 2022 trend, I guess post Uvalde, I guess you could probably call it, trend of these blue states adopting new assault weapons bans for the first time in like 30 years was really the last time you saw a movement like that. And it's a lot of states where people you sometimes get the reaction of, oh, I didn't even know they didn't already have that.
Right.
Like Illinois and Delaware and Rhode Island now. Which do you recall off the top of your head with the other?
Washington State was the other one.
Yeah, Washington. Yeah. So a lot of these states, and some of these, but also some areas where they're clearly trending. They were always Democratic, but they're trending more in favor of stricter gun laws, right? Like Washington and Rhode Island would be good examples of that, where like they've always been blue, right? At least for a very long time now.
Yeah.
But they were more reserved in their gun restrictions until recently. And so it does mark a pretty significant shift in that regard. And certainly it's probably not going to be the end of it. I mean, you also had Colorado, your home state, which this Rhode Island ban is a more traditional sales ban, whereas Colorado's is like a convoluted permit to purchase law or permit to possess law. My home state here in Virginia, maybe another one where this could happen in the relative relatively soon, given we have off-year elections this year. The Democrats seem to be polling better. We don't, obviously the election has not happened yet, and there's a lot that can happen between now and November, but historically off-year elections, you've seen the party that's out of power in the presidency does better. And so if that holds in Virginia, you're likely to see Democrats gain control of the state government here again. And last time they had it, similar to Colorado a couple of years ago, they weren't able to get an assault weapons ban through, but this Rhode Island law and Colorado before it, and Illinois and
New Mexico
Washington,
try.
Delaware,
Yeah.
New Mexico, it indicates perhaps this is going to be another big push in Virginia soon as well. And maybe a couple other states too. It won't be, like you said, New England or New Mexico is another one that really constantly on the cusp of passing something like this. So a real resurgence in these laws, and at a time when they've become increasingly constitutionally suspect, right? Where you've seen, the Supreme Court also in 2022 handed down Bruin, which, at least in theory, makes justifying modern gun restrictions like an assault weapons ban more difficult. However, of course, we've also seen a number of them upheld by federal courts. We've seen some struck down by some federal judges, but ultimately upheld by most appellate courts, because it goes back to that paradox we've talked about in the past of the states that pass these kind of laws tend to be governed by or overseen by federal circuits that are liberal, because they're the states that pass these laws are liberal. And so they have a more forgiving view of what can and can't be restricted by the government. And it makes it difficult to get circuit splits because the more conservative states don't pass these laws in the first place. And so the more conservative circuit courts don't get to review them. But either way, you've also seen the Supreme Court itself reject hearing these cases. Although obviously most recently in Snope v. Brown, right? Snope v. Brown. Yeah. The Maryland assault weapons ban case. We did have a explanation or statement from Justice Brett Kavanaugh where he said even though they weren't taking up the Maryland case, that they were likely to take up a case within a year or two. Could be this Rhode Island law for all we know. I'm sure that it's bound to be challenged in court, and we'll have to see where that all plays out. And Brett Kavanaugh, at the very least, has promised a showdown on this and some sort of conclusion from the Supreme Court in the next, I guess, 1 to 2 years, 2 to 3 years, maybe. 1 to 2 sittings of the court. I don't know. But sooner than later, in court time, right? Because 1 to 2 years is not very soon for most people, but in court time, it's pretty fast.
Yeah, particularly for folks that live in these states that continue to pass these restrictions. I think they see 1 to 2 years as almost an eternity for those folks. But like you said, we'll have to see this new dynamic, sort of the race between blue states and the Supreme Court as to how this is going to shake out. But speaking of courts, we have 2 other stories on some interesting appellate court rulings that came down. One out of the Ninth Circuit, where a 3-judge panel unanimously struck down California's kind of strange 1 gun a month, almost sort of rationing rule, where you can't purchase more than any kind of gun, more than one in a 30-day period, which they say is to combat things like gun trafficking and straw purchasing and the like. But a 3-judge panel has said that is unconstitutional.
Yeah, so pretty significant to see a Ninth Circuit panel. The Ninth Circuit, obviously has a reputation for being the most liberal circuit in the country, but has actually increasingly become more balanced in terms of judges appointed by Republicans and Democrats. So you're not necessarily seeing clean sweeps for the government in gun cases out there anymore. And this is an example of that.
Yeah. And we'll have to see, as has become fairly common in the Ninth Circuit, whenever a 3-judge panel strikes down a gun law, it's very common for that court to take it up again en banc, where the full court hears it. And at least gun rights advocates anyway complain that they often then uphold the law in that en banc ruling. So we'll have to see if that maintains in this case as well. But at least for now, they secured a significant victory in court. But sort of on the flip side, out of the Fourth Circuit, we had a ruling that I think a lot of people expected. But this ruling deals with the federal law that prohibits licensed firearm dealers from selling handguns to folks under the age of 21. In this case, the Fourth Circuit upheld the federal law, which creates a brand new circuit split with the Fifth Circuit.
Yeah, so another potential for Supreme Court to get involved here. Although that potential on questions of 18 to 20-year-old gun rights has been around for quite a while now, I guess. But that is what they usually like to see before they get involved is a circuit split. So
yeah,
here you go.
This one to me maybe is it's so hard to read what this court's going to do just because of how they've acted in some of these cases. But this one to me at least is a little juicier just because it's federal law this time. And you would think the court has an interest in maintaining uniformity of federal law, but I mean, that's nothing's guaranteed.
Yeah, I mean, they just made it much harder to get nationwide injunctions, so I don't. They seem pretty comfortable with an imbalance in how federal law is enforced. In some cases, at least, I don't know. So, but yeah, just generally hard to read the Supreme Court on what exactly their priorities are, especially in Second Amendment cases. I mean, that Kavanaugh statement in Snope is weird because he could have just been the fourth vote to take up the case, and instead he put down the statement of like, "Well, we'll do it in a year or two." Okay,
try again later.
Yeah,
but we'll see. Like I said, we'll have to see. And then getting into some of our outside of the Reload newsletter links, we had an interesting story from the Trace this week where they documented a fairly steep decline actually, in new lawsuits being filed by gun rights groups. Obviously, you mentioned the Bruin decision in 2022 really created an avalanche of new lawsuits from these gun rights groups who saw it as an opportunity to get these laws struck down. And it's sort of tapered off, at least according to this year. And it's not exactly clear why, although there's some ideas.
Yeah, I mean, well, first off, as they present in the piece, I mean, it's been a pretty steep decline, I guess, in the number of new cases filed, at least. That now you could also look at it cumulatively, right? Like, if you've already filed a case on against this one law, you're not going to file another case on it. So it's
true.
Maybe more, you should take into account the cumulative number. But yeah, the fact that new suits are down is pretty interesting. Only 3 years after Bruin. And it seems like there's a couple factors. I think one of the explanations they posit in the Trace story is this idea that, Trump has won the presidency. I think definitely this second time around, I don't know about Trump himself, but certainly the staff, the people staffing his administration seem much more willing to, embrace gun rights advocates' goals. So there's perhaps more attention being paid to trying for executive branch reforms over legal fights in this environment now, which is maybe not an unreasonable strategy shift on that. We've certainly seen a lot of these gun rights groups up their lobbying efforts, and the industry as well through the National Shooting Sports Foundation. They're spending more on lobbying than they have in the past. So that's potentially one explanation. The other one is, as we maybe sort of alluded to just now, like there may be a realization that the Bruin has not offered as much of a pathway to getting favorable rulings as gun rights advocates had hoped, right? I mean, we've seen a lot of these lower courts still come to basically the same conclusions in these cases around, for instance, hardware bans as they were before Bruin was handed down. And so, it didn't necessarily, early on, especially for like criminal defendants, I think there was a lot more volatility in how the federal courts were reacting to Bruin. But, especially in these more organized cases that are challenging state, gun laws, especially gun bans, you've definitely seen a level of uniformity from lower court judges on deciding these cases, and not in the favor of the gun rights advocates who filed them. So that could be part. And then again, going back to like the Supreme Court has not been very vigorously defending its precedent in Bruin. It hasn't been taking up many Second Amendment cases. I mean, again, you have to kind of look at the court timeline. They did take one new Second Amendment case since, over the last 3 years. So they've done 2 in the last 3 years. It's not, it's not like the gap between McDonald and Bruin, right? Which was, what was that, like 12 years? And you really only saw them take up one Second Amendment related case in that time. So it is a faster pace, but it's still not the main focus of what they're doing. They've done other gun related cases, but Second Amendment cases in particular, they haven't been taking a lot of these lower court decisions up and overturning them or anything like that. So that may be the reason you've seen some level of downturn in the number of new gun rights cases filed in the federal courts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of those factors are probably contributing, but nevertheless, interesting story that the Trace picked up on there. Worthwhile for readers. Then the last one we want to touch on as we're wrapping up here is another interesting story out of Roll Call, talking about Attorney General Pam Bondi defending the DOJ's current idea of merging the ATF and the DEA. The reason she's defending it is because it has sort of ignited a firestorm on all sides of the gun issue, where in a rare case of unity, they've all really come out swinging against this idea.
Yeah, pretty much everyone dislikes this outside of DOJ leadership, it sounds like. The ATF, I've talked to several ATF sources who don't like this idea of merging with the DEA. And then gun rights advocates have been staunchly opposed to it across the board, as has the gun industry. The National Shooting Sports Foundation is opposed to this as well. And I think even the gun control groups are also opposed to it. So
yep.
kind of a rare situation where you see something like this. And it, as far as Pam Bondi and the DOJ leadership goes, this is not like their idea. It's not a new idea. This has been around for decades now. First, it was proposed by the Clinton administration years ago as basically a cost saving measure. And that seems to be how Bondi is, essentially defending it in these hearings, where even Republicans have been extremely skeptical of the idea. I think even Lindsey Graham, who is who doesn't criticize the administration that often anymore. Most Republicans don't criticize the administration that often anymore. Not that, partisanship is what it is. You don't get a lot of Democrats criticizing Biden when he was in office either. But regardless, they have spoken out against this idea in particular. And so that's been kind of fascinating to see everybody lined up against this. And there's sort of a variety of reasons why people don't like it. Bondi has defended it as just a efficiency measure, cost savings. These agencies often work together a lot on task forces. Drug dealing and illegal guns are often things that go hand in hand. So you can sort of understand the logic of why you might want to combine these. You can save some money on administrative costs by having them all under one roof. And so that's more or less the logic they've used. They want to cut a lot from the ATF's budget as well. We talked about this last week when the DOJ's proposed budget cuts like almost $500 million from the ATF budget. And I think part of the savings would be the idea of, well, we can just merge them with DEA. But gun rights advocates don't like the idea, and the industry, I think, doesn't like the idea because basically they view it as kind of having the potential to supercharge the ATF. You're kind of making one much larger federal law enforcement agency where they all have the ability to enforce federal gun laws as one of their main mission objectives. So while you're cutting the ATF, you're also just making it part of a larger overall organization. So a lot of gun rights advocates don't like that idea. And I think also the industry doesn't like the idea of losing some of the specialization of ATF, where they're like, that's what they do is regulate the industry, and they don't necessarily, DEA, I think, is seen, and FBI as well. As another idea was combining them with FBI, right? But they're both seen as much more aggressive and much more, the FBI and DEA are not regulatory agencies like the ATF is. They're much more law enforcement focused, so they deal with criminals, and they have often very hard-nosed tactics when it comes to that. Not that the ATF hasn't been criticized for the same, obviously, especially among gun rights advocates. But I think the idea is you're going to get more of that if you combine them into an agency that is all about criminal enforcement and doesn't have a history of regulation like the ATF does with the industry. So, and then the ATF doesn't like it because they don't want to, lose their they don't want to lose priority inside of this larger organization, I guess is the idea. And they don't want to be kind of the little brother to the DEA in a merged agency. So and same thing for the gun control groups. I think it's the same idea there. Like they don't want the industry regulation aspect of ATF to get lost in this shuffle of this merger either. So I don't know. It seems like everybody thinks it's a bad idea, and probably not going to go anywhere, but we'll see.
Yeah, we'll have to see. They are, at least according to their budget documents, they imagine a very aggressive timeline on completing this merger starting as soon as this October. So this year is when they plan to actually make this merger happen. But like you said, it's obviously creating a lot of backlash on pretty much every side of this issue. So we'll have to see if they are successful in moving forward with this.
Yeah, and Congress is the one who controls the budget there. So
right.
You'd have to rewrite a lot of regulations and even laws that pertain to how the ATF is supposed to operate if you merged it with the DEA. But I mean, those are all things that could be done if you get enough political support to do it, I think. But I mean, there's also sort of a libertarian critique of just making more and more giant conglomerate federal law enforcement agencies. That's one of the big complaints about DHS is that it's this massive federal law enforcement agency that is hard to keep accountable and restrain and can lead to violations of people's rights and so forth. And you've seen that with some of the immigration enforcement stuff, where you just have like a blob of federal agents masked up and out on the streets doing stuff that's made people pretty unhappy in a number of cases. So there's that aspect to it as well, of just like a libertarian backlash to making a giant conglomerate federal law enforcement agency, or making more of them. We already have several, right? But anyway, we'll have to see how it shakes out, whether Republicans get on board with it. I don't believe it's part of this. It's not part of this big budget reconciliation package. It would be part of, I think, other legislation down the line dealing with appropriations, but it's definitely something that we'll stay on top of.
Absolutely.
But I think that's all we've got story-wise this week, right? I mean, there's a lot more in the newsletter, of course. You should head over to thereload.com and sign up for the free weekly newsletter if you haven't. We only get to cover part of what goes into the newsletter on the News Update podcast here. So it really is valuable to go over and actually read the full newsletter. It's also on the website. Just go to reload.com. We put the full newsletter up there as well. But yeah, how's your weekend shaking up? I mean, it looks like we're gonna have to, at least I'm gonna have to stay around and pay attention to what goes on with the budget bill, because if they want to meet that July 4th deadline, they're gonna have to move really fast. But so we may have to write some more updates over the weekend too, on whatever happens there, what the text ends up actually being. But what about you? You have any plans or anything fun going on?
Yeah, not necessarily fun. Well, sort of fun, I guess, depending on your point of view, but mostly wrapping up final loose ends for the wedding. It's actually officially a month out until I get married. So it's kind of crunch time, dealing with all the vendors and the planning and the wedding planner.
Yeah.
And so
I gotta
work
do
that's not
this
work,
weekend too.
Yeah.
We've got to start making final decisions. Ours is in October, so we got a little more time, but oh man, I don't want to spend money is the big problem, and that's impossible.
I hear you. This stuff is expensive.
But yeah, and then I might get the haircut. My fiance doesn't want the long hair for the wedding, and also we finally got a brutal heat wave here in the Virginia DC area, and so I have also come around to the idea that maybe I should cut off the hair. It gets like frizzy when it's hot, when it's too humid, and also it's just a lot of hair when it's hot out. So, I might look different next time we record this. We'll see. But yeah, looking forward to it. The Phillies are still in first place despite scoring one run. I think they're still in first place. They might have fallen to second in the NL East, despite scoring a single run over the last 3 games and getting swept by the Astros. And not a single Philly has made the All-Star team voting, despite being the first place team. So at least not a single fielder. Maybe one of the pitchers will get in. But so that's such a classic Phillies situation where it's like, well, we're in first place and also we suck. So maybe they'll turn it around this weekend. I think they're playing the Braves, so maybe they'll come alive to play a rival. We'll see. But I guess that's all we've got for this week. Keep tuned to the Reload, though, for more updates on what goes on with this budget bill, its reconciliation, and the NFA provisions, because something's going to happen. There'll be some development. I also think it's very likely they still get some. They're having a lot of back and forth on the details of what the end package is going to be. And, there were a lot of other provisions that the parliamentarian stripped out that cause math problems for this bill. But I think it's unlikely that they're not going to get something through. They'll get something through. I think that I'm pretty confident that this is their big thing for the first 2 years of the Trump administration, honestly. And maybe the only big thing, because if they lose the midterms, they lose control of Congress, they're not going to be passing any more bills that they really want. So we'll have to see what happens there. But I think they'll probably get something through, and we'll have to watch what the text is for this NFA provision if it makes it in. But so keep reloading every second, thereload.com. Just sit there until you get some news breaking. That's my advice. All right. That's all we've got for you guys this week. We'll see you again real soon.
No, the devil's got no